Welcome back. In this video, we'll study Daniel 2 verses 14 to 23, and we'll see Daniel's response to the threat posed by the king's order to put the wise men of Babylon to death. Let's read the text. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, "Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. So, having heard of the king's angry, irrational decision, which puts his own life at risk, notice that Daniel responds calmly, with wisdom and tact. And he asks, why did the king make this harsh decision? And having learned what led to the decision, Daniel goes into the king and he asks for some more time to interpret the dream for the king. There is, I believe, here an immediate contrast between the king's lack of wisdom, as demonstrated in his angry, irrational decision to put all the wise men to death, and in Daniel's wisdom and tact in responding to this decision calmly by asking questions to understand what lay behind it instead of panicking and reacting out of fear. Our brains tend to shut down when they're controlled by emotions like anger or fear, and that often leads us to make foolish decisions or act irrationally. Wisdom requires calm, patient deliberation and brains not hijacked by our flight or fight, adrenaline-driven survival mechanism. Calmness and patience in the face of angry threats and danger comes from a right disposition towards God that the Bible refers to as the fear of the Lord. So, for instance, in Proverbs 9:10, we're told that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. Wisdom doesn't come from Babylonian literature or education, such as Nebuchadnezzar was subjecting Daniel and his friends to in chapter 1, but wisdom comes from fearing God and from being faithful to him. Later in Daniel 2, we'll see that Daniel's ability to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream doesn't come from the Babylonian literature that Nebuchadnezzar had inculcated or educated him with, but from God. But here in verses 14 to 16, we also see that calmness and patience in the face of angry threats and danger comes from a right disposition towards God, which is what the Bible calls the fear of the Lord. It comes from seeing God in the correct light, as greater than all and sovereign, and to be feared, and standing in awe of him. And it comes from seeing all things in life, including our greatest problems, in relation to God and in the correct perspective as being small compared to him and completely under his control, as the sovereign God over all things. Daniel understands the message of the book and of chapter 2, which is, despite present difficulties, God is in control and he will have the final word. This understanding is what enables Daniel to respond with wisdom that comes from the fear of the Lord and not in folly, which comes from the fear of man. As J. Paul Tanner puts it, in contrast with the king's violent explosion of anger, Daniel reacts with calmness and rational thinking. This is a mark of a believer under control of the Holy Spirit and one who understands how the sovereignty of God works. I think that's well put. Well, we could also think of Joyce Baldwin's statement in relation to this. She says, the ability to keep calm under severe shock and pressure, to think quickly and exercise faith in a moment of crisis, these are aspects of prudence and discretion seen in Daniel here. And she references Philippians 4 and verse 7. So Daniel's calm is a reflection of his wisdom, as Joyce Baldwin has just said. And the words that she refers to as prudence and discretion are in the NIV translated as wisdom and tact. These are wisdom words, like we would expect to be used in the book of Proverbs. In fact, there are clear contrasts in the wisdom book of Proverbs, which reflects different responses that we see demonstrated by Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel to this moment of crisis. Now, if you recall during the introductory video on how to read Daniel, I pointed out that the court tales were written as wisdom stories to tell the Jews living under oppression or foreign rule how best to live and succeed in these difficult times. Well, the contrast between Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel is intended to teach God's people, including us, how best to live in difficult circumstances and to remain faithful to God. Well, here are some examples of the contrast between the foolish person angrily giving way to fear like Nebuchadnezzar and the wise person calmly responding to crisis because they fear God that the book of Proverbs gives us. In Proverbs 14 and verse 17, we're told that a quick-tempered person does foolish things and the one who devises evil schemes is hated. That sounds like a description of Nebuchadnezzar. In Proverbs 14 and 29, whoever is patient has great understanding. That's Daniel. But one who's quick-tempered displays folly. That's Nebuchadnezzar. Proverbs 29:22, an angry person stirs up conflict, and a hot-tempered person commits many sins. That's Nebuchadnezzar. Proverbs 12:16, fools show their annoyance at once, but the prudent overlook an insult. And then Proverbs 29 and verse 11, a fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back. And then we can learn from the opposite, which is the wisdom that comes from the fear of God. Proverbs 15 and verse 1, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And we can think of Daniel responding gently to the threat of death. Or in Proverbs 15 verse 18, a hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but one who is patient calms a quarrel. Or 16:32, better a patient person than a warrior, one with self-control than one who takes a city. Or 19:11, a person's wisdom yields patience, it is to one's glory to overlook an offense. Or Proverbs 17 and 27, the one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and whoever has understanding is even-tempered. I think we can learn from this contrast between Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel how to respond to crises, threats, and dangers, fears in our lives today as we face difficult circumstances. The key, I think, is to remember, like Daniel, that despite difficult circumstances, God is in control and will have the final word. Well, having been granted some more time by the king in order to interpret the dream, Daniel returns to his house. And we read that Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said. We're going to come back to his actual prayer, but what we see here is that Daniel responds by involving his friends and praying with them to God for God's mercy in revealing the mystery of the king's dream so that they would not be put to death with the other wise men of Babylon. And God answers their prayer that very night by revealing the mystery of the dream to Daniel in a vision. In response, Daniel praises the God of heaven. And we'll read his prayer of praise in a moment, but before we do that, we should also observe and take note of his wisdom displayed in the actions that he takes in response to the threat that is faced by the king's order. First of all, Daniel chooses to pray to God instead of giving in to anxiety. He chooses to rely on God rather than on himself. And this reminds me of Philippians 4 and verses 4 to 7, where Paul writes, "Rejoice in the Lord always." I will say it again. Rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your mind in Christ Jesus. Prayer produces gentleness, sweet reasonableness, instead of the harsh unreasonableness that anxiety and fear tends to produce, such as we see exhibited by Nebuchadnezzar. Paul says the Lord is near. And Daniel's God is in fact a personal God who is near and able to bring deliverance. Daniel's prayerful, trusting action guards his heart and his mind from the foolish action that can be produced out of fear and anxiety and anger. Secondly, Daniel prays to God because of his understanding of who God is. And I think here of James 1:5, where James writes, "If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you." Daniel prays to God for wisdom because he knows his God to be a personal, generous God who gives generously to all without finding fault. This is quite different than the Babylonian wise men who said that only the gods could reveal to the king his dream, but the gods don't live among men. Daniel knew and believed his God to be a personal and a generous God who was accessible by prayer and who would reveal mysteries to his people to save them, and so Daniel prays to his God. It is his faith and his trust in this God and knowledge of the nature and character of this God developed from his relationship with God that leads him to pray. This faith and trust would have been developed and strengthened from experiences such as we read about in Daniel 1, where Daniel trusted God and God generously gave him what he needed. James 1:5 is itself drawn from Proverbs 2 verses 3 to 6. And there we read that the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. So Daniel turns to God for wisdom that he needs in respect of the king's dream because he understands that his God is a God who will give it. Thirdly, I want you to notice that Daniel doesn't pray alone, but he involves his community in knowing about and praying about the problem. And we read in Matthew 18 and verse 19 that if 2 or 3 agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am with them. There does seem to be an added strength to our prayers when they are offered in community. But as well, the book of Ecclesiastes tells us in chapter 4 and verse 9 that 2 are better than 1. And it goes on to say, because they have a good return for their labor, if either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. If 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. The point is that Daniel is able to receive the strength of encouragement from a community, but as well, he strengthens his own prayers by inviting his friends to pray with him to their God to give them the answer that they need in order to save their lives. Well, as a reminder, Daniel 2 has a chiastic structure, and this structure suggests that the heart of the passage is found at the center of the chiasm. That is, the central emphasis of the entire chapter is on Daniel's prayer, praising God's sovereign control over history and God's ability to reveal future mysteries. Daniel's praise, and not the dream, is in fact the center of the story. As Joe Sprinkle himself puts it, he says, arguably, this prayer at the heart of the chapter's chiastic structure is the theological center of this chapter, more central than the dream and its interpretation. Next, I'd like for us to, before we examine Daniel's prayer, consider the name that Daniel uses here to refer to God. Daniel refers to God as the God of heaven. The book of Daniel refers to God as the God of heaven a number of times in Daniel chapter 2, beginning with this prayer. Interestingly, the divine name Yahweh is never used in the Aramaic section of the book. And so there are a number of different expressions used in the Aramaic section to refer to the God of Israel. The God of heaven is in fact rarely used in the Hebrew Bible to refer to the God of Israel, but one such occasion is in Genesis 24, verse 7. It became a rather common way of referring to God during the exile and the post-exilic period. And this expression may have seemed quite appropriate for the Jews during this time when they were living among the Gentiles and they wanted to distinguish their God from the multitude of other gods worshipped by the Gentiles. In contrast to the Babylonian wise men, therefore, who worshipped the starry heaven and sought to determine the future by supernatural knowledge through astrological means, Daniel's God was the creator of the heavens and the one holding all the stars and the celestial bodies in place. And I'm paraphrasing here from Paul Tanner's Daniel commentary. Well, as Joe Sprinkle puts it, the expression the God of heavens or the God of heaven, most English versions, is one of the many names and titles of God in Daniel. And it is used to show God above and beyond this world. It's used in Genesis 24 and the New Testament and Revelation, and it is not unknown in the biblical world outside the Bible. When we get back to the text, well, before we get back to the text, I do have another quote from Joe Sprinkle that I would share with you. Hopefully this will help in your understanding of the term, the God of heaven. As a title for Yahweh, it emphasizes his superiority over and power to control the world. Like the parallel title, King of Heavens, it's relevant here. The title suggests that though he is above and beyond this world, he nonetheless looks from there upon his people on earth, concerned and willing to answer their petitions. So Daniel's God is a God above the earth and in the heavens, but he is a God who is still concerned enough and personal enough in his interactions with his people to answer their prayers, such as to reveal a dream to save their life. Well, let's read now Daniel's prayer of praise. Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes time and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and knowledge. You have made known to me what we ask of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. Daniel praises God to whom belongs wisdom and power. From Daniel's prayer of praise, I want you to notice that God is sovereign over both wisdom and power. As Paul Tanner points out from the literary structure of the prayer, clearly the focus of Daniel's praise was for God's wisdom and power. Notice how these terms are repeated in both verse 20 and verse 23. In fact, the prayer is carefully structured around these concepts. So notice that at A and A prime, we have a praise for God, which repeats the fact that God possesses or gives wisdom and power. So the beginning of the prayer, God possesses wisdom and power. And at the end of the prayer, God dispenses wisdom and power. And he's praised for both. But in the middle, we have at B and B prime, first description of God's power as being the one who controls human thrones. And then a description of God's wisdom. God has all understanding and reveals hidden knowledge to men. So this wisdom and power should be seen in regard to the dream and its revelation about the future kingdoms. God's power is illustrated by his complete control over the events of history. And verse 21 indicates that he changes time and eras, deposing some kings and establishing other kings. Because God controls the time and eras, he intervenes especially in establishing and deposing earthly kings. And then God's wisdom is seen in his infinite knowledge and understanding of everything, and by his ability to reveal that to men of his choosing. And in verse 22, light dwells with God. This reflects God's omniscience, his complete awareness of all that exists and of all that can happen and will happen. So Daniel's prayer in verses 20 to 23 serves primarily to characterize God as the source of wisdom and power over both wise men and kings. So, God then is sovereign over both wisdom and power. He's omniscient or all-knowing, and he's omnipotent or all-powerful, to use those theological categories. God is sovereign or in control of wisdom, in that knowledge dwells with him, and he gives wisdom and knowledge to the discerning, and he reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness. Nothing is hidden from him, even if it is hidden from men, like the king and his wise men, and light dwells with God. And since God is in control of wisdom, he has given Daniel wisdom by revealing the king's dream. Daniel's God is, as Nebuchadnezzar will later say, therefore, a revealer of mysteries. Unlike the gods of Babylon, who do not dwell with mortals and would not reveal to them what was impossible for men to know on their own, Daniel's God is sovereign over knowledge and wisdom, but he's a personal God who reveals mysteries to his people who ask him. And when the prayer says that he gives wisdom to the wise, it is an ironic statement, because the wise men of Babylon had nothing to offer the king, whereas the one man who sought God's wisdom, Daniel, was made truly wise. Such is the case for those who know the true source of wisdom, a wisdom that is not of this world. Also, when the passage says that he gives wisdom to the wise, this means not that only the wise receive the gift of extra wisdom, but that wherever there's wisdom, it has been received as a gift from only God, who is its source. So one half of the prayer is dealing with God as a revealer of mysteries, a God who is all-knowing and will reveal the truth to his people. But the other half deals with God as a God who is all-powerful. God is sovereign in power, or all-powerful, and therefore he's in control of all things. God changes the time and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He's in control of human kingdoms, and he sets their times on this earth. This truth is going to be revealed in the king's dream about the human kingdoms. And in response, Nebuchadnezzar will call God not just a revealer of mysteries, but a Lord of kings. Because God is sovereign in power, although there are human kingdoms which will present current and future difficulties for God's people need not fear, because God is sovereign in power and in control, and he will have the final word. God says when these kingdoms will rise and when they will fall, and in the end, his kingdom will endure forever, and he will have the last word. Well, whatever our present difficulties are, individually and personally, or corporately and internationally, God is sovereign in wisdom and power, and he will have the final word. We need to rest in this truth by praying to him individually and in community like Daniel and his friends, trusting him to deliver us and to control the events of history unfolding around us, wisely and peacefully waiting on him, as Daniel and God's people have done throughout time, because they know who he is. In our next study, we'll study Daniel 2, verses 24 to 30, in which Daniel goes before the king.